Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the November online talk from the Society of Army Historical Research. These are becoming more and more popular, I'm glad to say, and we are almost at the 100 people registered for this evening's talk. Now, I'm conscious of the fact that although we've got 100 people registered, not everyone will be attending the live session, because one of the selling points of the Society of Army Historical Research's online talks are that if you register for the event, you're guaranteed to receive a copy of the recording. And so we normally get about a 50% attendance on the night, and I can see the numbers climbing as I'm talking. I always, for those that are regular attenders, I always start the proceedings with an explanation of how Demio works. I do it for two reasons. One, to fill that time to allow people to get into the room. And secondly, conscious of the fact that for some people, this is their first experience of this platform. So Demio, if you've not experienced it before, works on the strength of your broadband connection. So for the vast majority of people who are watching the talk tonight, you will experience no difficulties whatsoever with either your audio or your video feed. But occasionally you might do, and that's because of the weakness of your broadband connection at home. If that happens to you this evening, there are what I call 3 immediate action drills that you can take to try to rectify the problem. The first IA drill is simply to refresh the page. And as I say every month, I say refresh the page, and I'm certain that there will be people in the room who don't know how to do that. So on almost every browser out there, there is a small incomplete circle with an arrow on it in the browser window, and that's your refresh button. So if you click on that, it will refresh your page. And 9 times out of 10, that will correct any problems you might be having with your audio or your video feed. If that doesn't work, your second IA drill would be to use what I call the IT crowd solution, which is simply to leave the room and then come back again using the same link, the link that you used to join this evening. And the third IA drill, if those two don't work, is, and if you have the opportunity to use a different browser, is to use that different browser to come back into the room. So I'm broadcasting this evening on Chrome browser, but Demio also works on Microsoft Edge, Firefox, and Safari. So if you have access to a different browser, you can use the link that you've got this evening in that browser, and that third IA drill would sort the problem out. And if you are really, really unlucky, then all I can say is I'm sorry, but you are guaranteed a copy of the recording, and that will be sent out later this evening and certainly by first thing tomorrow morning. The next announcement I'd like to make is on behalf of the Treasurer of the Society. These talks are free to members of the Society and to non-members, and we make no charge. But if at the end of the talk you feel compelled to give the Society some money to thank them for putting this online talk together, then please feel free to go to the Society's page, and you can see that there's an ability to donate a small sum of money if you would wish to do so. So Rowan, I hope I've done what you asked me to do as the Treasurer this evening, and to publicise that fact. Okay, that's enough by way of introduction, and I can see another 10 people have already joined the room as I've been speaking. The last thing I have to say, however, is, and this is for the purpose of the people who are watching this recording, when we get to the Q&A session, I'm able to put the questions up on the screen. But unfortunately, when you see it on recording, Demio does not allow you to see those questions. So for that reason, I read out the questions for your benefit, and I suppose to somewhat of the annoyance of the audience in the live session, who can perfectly read for themselves. But that's why I do it. And I also encourage you in the live audience to write your questions as they occur to you this evening. If our speaker this evening covers the point that you have raised subsequent in his talk, then obviously I won't put that question to him. But it does save time at the end when there's a rush for you to type in your question. Okay, enough by way of introduction then. Can I ask Glenn to come onto stage, please, and I'll formally introduce you. Hi, Glenn.
Hello.
There's no pressure this evening, Glenn. I've just seen your wife sign in, and she's said hello from Staffordshire in the chat box. And also your publisher is here this evening. There's someone from Helium Press this evening in the audience.
No pressure at all on any front.
So Glenn is a shining example of it's never too late to come into academia. He studied at Keele University, medieval history as an undergraduate, but as a mature student. Then he did his MRes and then completed his PhD. And when looking for a subject to do his PhD on, he started by thinking that he would like to explore supply and logistics. And as someone who thinks that's really underrated area of research, I think that's fantastic. And then having decided that he wanted to look at supply and logistics, then looked around for a period where he could add value. And he said to me earlier that he didn't want to read medieval texts anymore. And so that's why he alighted on what I used to call the English Civil Wars, but are now more fashionably termed as the British Civil Wars. So that's the subject of his talk this evening is supply and logistics, the British Civil Wars. And I think that's enough from me. I'm going to leave the stage and hand over to Glenn for his talk. I will then come back to lead the question and answer session. So Glenn, over to you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Dudley, and hello to you all. It's a genuine pleasure to be here to give a paper for the Society. I was lucky enough to be awarded one of the SAHR's research grants near the start of my PhD in order to do some archival research, and I'm grateful to be able to present back to the Society on some of what the SAHR contributed to. So, as the title of my talk says, I'll be giving an introduction on the operational realities of logistics and supply during the British Civil Wars of the 17th century. Despite the focus on these wars, much of these operational realities would have been similar in other places and in other conflicts before and after these. I've also thrown together a short handout, which I hope will be useful to people. As I appreciate I'm going to be throwing quite a lot of information at you this evening, and Dudley will put them up for you to access if you so wish or feel the need. Before I go any further, let me just clarify what I mean by these British Civil Wars. It's effectively a shorthand for that series of interconnected conflicts that raged across the British Isles, then including the Kingdom of Ireland, from 1639 to 1653. These conflicts included the First and Second Bishops' Wars, the Irish Rebellion, the Wars of the Irish Confederation, the English Civil Wars, and the Cromwellian conquest of Scotland and Ireland. For brevity and to reflect the interconnected nature of these conflicts, I'll be using the British Civil Wars as an umbrella term, but when I speak about a specific conflict, I'll name it at that point. But what makes these conflicts so interesting as a study of logistic and supply systems is that they actually occurred following an extended period of internal peace, which extended across several decades. In comparison to the contemporary European experience, which was riven with inter-realm conflicts, extensive armed rebellions against established imperial dynasties, civil and religious wars, and uprisings during the first half of the 17th century, the British Isles experience, after the 9 Years' War, which ended in 1603, was one of extended internal peace. During this period, there were no substantial standing armies. There were some small garrisons and there were militia companies, but any military logistics and supply systems needed to be created pretty much from scratch when the civil wars broke out and had very little pre-existing military infrastructure to go on. There were, at that time extensive numbers of men from the Stuart realms of England and Wales, Scotland and Ireland fighting in the wars of the continent. But these were not forces raised by the king and his governments for service with any of the kingdoms. There were crown forces fighting in wars in this period, before the civil wars, in wars against Spain and France as part of Charles I's foreign policies. But again, these were fought as external expeditionary conflicts. And although they did leave a legacy of political animosity within the British Isles, they left no meaningful impact or had any real development in the military logistics within the Isles. Another caveat, this talk will be focusing on the experience of armies of the period rather than that of the navies. And for this evening's paper, I'll be focusing primarily on the land-based logistics and supply, the transportation systems. There's a lot that can be said about feeding, clothing, manoeuvring and recruiting armies, but we've got a finite amount of time, so I'll focus on the requirements for building a transportation network to supply all of those to the troops. The armies of the period did make extensive use of water-based transport systems where possible, where wind, tide and current could provide bulk transport. But when this was neither available nor suitable, again, they fell back to the land transportation networks via roads. Now, these land transportation methods were entirely reliant on the muscle power of animals. And in the British Isles at the time, this meant either in draft, so pulling a vehicle in a harness, or with pack, carrying the cargo in packs across the back of the animal. So consequently, the armies and campaign in this period, and for centuries before and after, made use of large numbers of animals pulling wheeled transport vehicles and hauling supplies with the infantry regiments, cavalry troops, and artillery in order to keep these all supplied. The varying available methods of transportation were critical to the strategic and tactical decisions of the wars, as how quickly an army could move, where it moved, and how long it could campaign for were all impacted by the types of transportation available to it. This meant that the strategy of the wars itself was impacted by the transport capabilities available to the armies. But what exactly were the types of transportation available to them? They were not all the same. Regional variation of types and availability meant that even within the British Civil Wars, opposing forces and sometimes even allied forces could have significantly different supply methods, each with varying efficiencies, and looked very different. Now, there is a wealth of information surviving about the types of vehicles available to the military of the period. However, it is almost entirely from what we might term civilian sources, rather than the traditional military sources such as garrison accounts, letters between senior officers, or military reports. Instead, the picture of contemporary transport is found mostly amongst surviving wills, probate inventories, and particularly in the contemporary carriers' guides. This is not, as it might first appear, any sort of an issue. As we shall see, the military drew its vehicles in a variety of ways, but always from civilians. So the same vehicles that served local and regional communities were also the same types of vehicles that supplied the armies. The reliance of the military on civilian vehicles and its infrastructure will be made clear as this talk goes on. But yet again, one of the best sources for the information on civilian practices were the aforementioned guides. So these contemporary publications were produced for the wider civilian population, detailing the carrier transport services available for hire. Now, these carriers were effectively national carriers who operated between a point of origin and usually London or another major town. And they served all of the towns and stops between that along the route that they chose. Excuse me. And from the details of the guides, we can tell that they all had set routes that they continually worked. We also know that there were multiple routes between 2 points. So multiple carriers might serve the route between Chester and London, but they would go via different routes. One might go via Stafford, another might go via Nottingham. So the authors of these works clearly recognised there was enough demand for transport services in order to sell their books. They went into significant detail, and John Taylor's cosmography, which is up on the screen there, has more than 200 entries detailing routes, availability, and services offered by carriers solely on the London route. Now, this is important because the carrier's cosmography and other guides make clear that there was only about two major major types of vehicles operating on the route. But these professional carriers, whichever type of vehicle they used, it was from these that the government often requisitioned wagons, teams for its own uses in peacetime, and this continued in certain stages of the war as well. So before the wars broke out, these carriers moved a wide variety of loads. I mean, they moved agricultural produce, they moved finished goods, personal deliveries between individuals even, as well as serving government needs between major towns and London. The two types of vehicles most commonly used by carriers were either the four-wheeled wagon or the pack horse train. There was in service across the British Isles at that time the two-wheeled cart, but we'll go into that in a bit more detail a little later. So the wagon was a large two-axle, four-wheeled vehicle pulled by a team of at least 4 horses, and it could carry as many as 8 horses to pull if the load or circumstances demanded it. Now, these wagons were distinct from the cart, being both larger and more substantial, and having 4 wheels rather than 2. This four-wheeled configuration gave them much more stable platform and a larger bed for transporting goods for the storage area. And the superiority of wagons as a transport and haulage vehicle was evidenced from their comparatively rapid adoption across multiple areas of society, beginning with its introduction in England the previous century. It most likely came from the Low Countries. Wagon is a Dutch word. And in southern and eastern England, the wagon was so widely adopted by farmers, tradesmen, and other professional teamsters, local businesses, that by the late 1630s, the wagon was a dominant form of road transport vehicle used in all of the east and southeast of England. Now, the use of pack horses predated the arrival of the wagon on England shores by some time, where the cargo was transported in panniers across the back of the animal rather than pulled in a wheeled conveyance. Despite the advantages of the wagon as a vehicle, the pack horse remained a popular form of transport amongst these carriers from western, northern, southeastern England and from Wales. Now, this does raise a question about why carriers from these areas stayed with the pack horse, particularly when you think that a horse pulling in draft can convey about 3 times the amount of weight that a horse can carry on its back. So a draft horse was capable of much more efficiency. But there are reasons to explain why the pack horses remain popular. They were typically ponies, despite being called pack horses, same species as a horse, but identifiably different. They were smaller, thicker coats, tended to have tougher hooves, heavily built with shorter legs, and they could survive on types of pasture that was seen by contemporaries as being insufficient to feed a larger horse. So they were hardier, smaller, stockier, and they do better in cooler temperatures and on rougher ground. So many of the areas where the pack horse's point of origin came from were predominantly pastoral in this period. They weren't as heavily agriculturally based as areas in the east or southeast of England. Rather more rugged terrain, and they stand as quite a different topographical type of ground to that in the east and the southeast of England. This slide might make that a little clearer. So this is the topographical dispersal of England and Wales. And as you can perhaps see from the key, the west, north and southwest of England and Wales itself is being substantially higher than the rest of the east and the southeast of England. The dispersal of wagons being confined to the southeast and east of England in the 17th century is confirmed by work by other historians, notably socio-economic historians. One of them, Stephen Porter, states that while wagons became popular sights on England's roads, it was not until well into the 1700s, so 50 years or more after the period under discussion, that they became common farm vehicles across the whole of England. Now, the other form of vehicle in this use was the cart. Now, unlike the four-wheeled wagon, carts were single-axled, two-wheeled vehicles. And although by the 1630s a wagon was the wheeled heavy goods vehicle of choice, the cart remained ubiquitous across the British Isles in all other roles, from farming to local businesses to even small local regional hauling areas. But they didn't serve on the carrier trade, and they weren't seen as a majorly efficient transportation vehicle when compared to the wagon. Now, I don't know if you could tell from the slide, I'll move it back a couple in a moment, but the contemporary engraving there shows not only a substantially smaller vehicle than the wagon, but you can see that the team is a lot smaller. There you go. So compared to the driver on the horse and the size of the horses as well, the cart is a notably smaller vehicle. Now, this was well known by contemporaries. By the time of the Civil Wars, it was common knowledge that it was distinctly different from the wagon in both name and construction, and the cart was understood to be a much smaller vehicle. When the Earl of Essex's army had to re-equip after the disaster of the Battle of Lostwithiel in 1644, the list of equipment requirements stipulated the differences between wagons and carts. For the rebuilding of their artillery train, they needed 24 wagons of one kind, and then they needed another 15 wagons on top of that. But if they couldn't have those 15 wagons, then they would need 24 carts instead. This ratio of 15 to 24, or a little over 60%, ties in well with what socio-economic historians of the period have estimated to be the carrying capacity differences between a wagon and a cart. But it does all pull together to suggest that the cart had less than 2/3 the carrying capacity of a wagon. The wagon could carry, the four-wheeled wagon could carry about 2 tons. So on that basis, cart could carry a little over 1 ton, probably about 1¼ tons compared to the 2-ton cart. That's quite a significant difference. Now, an individual pack horse could carry around 240 pounds on its back. So compare that to the wagon in draft that can pull 2 tons. A single wagon with a team of 6 could move as much, if not more than, about 18 pack horses. So if we place this in context with what the military judged to be the differences in cart capacity, we can have a rudimentary comparison for the military loads of the 3 main forms of land transport: wagons, carts and pack horses. And I'm hoping the next series of slides will make that a bit more clear. So 10 wagons, each with a team of 6 horses. That's 60 horses in total. Now that could transport around 20 tons, that amount shown on the slide. Now that's the same, to transport that same 20 tons, you'd need about 16 wagons and possibly as many as 80 horses. So it might not seem much on an individual basis, but as soon as you start talking larger amounts, the numbers do make a significant difference. Now, the transport capacity of either 10 wagons or 16 carts would need about 110 pack horses to match. To emphasize how many wagons, carts or pack horses an army might need, the planned transport needs of a single English infantry regiment during the Bishop's War was 1 vehicle and team for each of its 10 companies. So the 10 wagons and 60 horses in the top of that slide would serve only 1 infantry regiment in 1639. Another way to highlight it might be that an infantry regiment would probably need, on the expected ration of food, the best part of a ton of bread and probably about half a ton of cheese every day. So again, if we just take one of those for the 10 wagons and 60 horses, or the 16 carts and the 80 horses, either one of those might keep 2 regiments in the field in food for maybe a week, probably a little less. Now, I've only been talking in terms of horses at the moment, and there's for a reason. They were preferred to pulling vehicles rather than oxen, despite the oxen being more popular in earlier centuries. The oxen had previously been the stronger beast of burden, but due to changes in the breeding of horses and actual laws implemented to improve draft horse capacity during the Tudor period, the strength of oxen versus horses had been dramatically reduced, or I should say that the horses' strength had been improved. An often perceived advantage of oxen over horses was that oxen were fed only grass. It sounds like it's easier and cheaper to do, but in the military context, that just means that you need access to more lush grass more often to feed your transport animals, whereas horses take a more varied diet, which can include cereal, oats, dry fodder. Horses get on better with that than oxen do. So it's actually, you'll require less disbursement and less good fresh grass to feed your draft animals if you're going for horses rather than oxen. Horses were also faster than ox. This may have been proven important for carrier roles, but it was certainly seen as paramount for military needs. Not only were they faster, but also you can shoe a horse or even a pony much easier than you can an ox, and so they suffer less damage to their feet. It's easier for a shod horse to be able to carry heavy loads or to pull heavy loads in poor terrain, bad conditions, roads that have been upset or damaged due to weather and things of that nature. Having said all that, there were oxen used in various periods of the British Civil Wars, but normally out of necessity, not through choice. So the Royalists were using oxen in their artillery train at the outbreak of the English Civil War, and were constantly trying to sell them and use the money to buy horses instead. And it took them probably as much as a year and a half before they were able to sell the limited numbers of oxen they'd got to replace them with horses. The situation was somewhat different in Ireland. Ireland had next to no native draft horse breeding capability and was largely reliant on English import of sales for draft horses. And in fact, with the outbreak of the Irish Rebellion in 1641, in order to supply the Protestant forces that were gathering in Ireland, whole teams of draft horses and wagons were shipped over to Ireland to try and meet the supply needs of the Protestant forces. But even this limited supply of wagons with horse teams stopped when the English Civil War broke out, because that stopped any supplies going over to Ireland as the Royalists and Parliamentarians were fighting over them. The dearth of wagons and heavy horses reflected the prevalence of cattle in Ireland's primarily pastoral farming economy, which made limited use of draft horses anyway. And this was not dissimilar to the pastoral regions in England, Wales, and Scotland at the time, but their carrier and transport uses often found their way using carts and pack ponies rather than the ox. But again, without the ability to import them, without a native extensive draft horse breeding program, Ireland and forces in Ireland, both Protestant and Catholic, were forced to rely on the oxen as the main transportation animal. And this continued throughout all of the wars. The situation didn't really get any better, even as late as 1647 with the Battle of Dungan's Hill, and in 1649 at the Battle of Rathmines, respectively 6 and 8 years after the rebellion had first broken out. The victorious parliamentarian forces gleefully incorporated captured Irish Confederate artillery and clearly the oxen that were pulling them into their own artillery train. But how did the army secure these transportation? I've told you how the civilians had them, and now we need to make clear the connection between the civilians and the military in order how the military made use of them in their supply. Well, it was sometimes through directly purchasing, but most often it was through a form of requisition. And this requisition could either be through hiring or through impressment. But while purchasing vehicles might at first glance appear to be the most effective means of quickly guaranteeing the required number of vehicles, the long period of internal peace prior to the wars meant that there was not a large pool of government maintained vehicles and horse teams ready and waiting should war ever break out. No army of the period in any time of peace had the money to keep a large pool of potentially useful animals and wagons on standby just in case. Any historians of the period will tell you that the armies were continually short of money as it was, and so they wouldn't have spent anything on that in any significant numbers. The English Ordnance Office, which was located in the Tower of London, did have some skilled craftsmen on site who could theoretically maintain and monitor such a pool of transport vehicles. However, these were more individuals than teams of artisans, and they had their hands full, even in peacetime, maintaining the very limited number of either carriages or even the gun carriages and the artillery in the various forts and fortifications that were on the coastline of Britain at the time, and of course supplying the needs of the navy. At the outbreak of the Bishops' War, the English Council of War was clearly extremely optimistic because they immediately placed an order for 400 wagons for use of the army. They stipulated that this purchase was for the constructing of vehicles rather than outright purchasing any that might have been available. And this seems to have been a bit of a problem. It's doubtful they would have ever been able to find 400 wagons readily available to purchase. Even the ones that were owned by civilians were an expensive proposition, and they were the carrier's main living. So he wouldn't have been up for selling them at anything other than outrageous prices. But the demands of 400 wagons to go with the army was not only wildly optimistic, it was also impossible to achieve. The collaborative nature of the work in order to make a vehicle requires several skilled craftsmen, and this includes carpenters, blacksmiths, wheelwrights, farriers, and leather workers if we're throwing in the equipment needed for the horses as well. And these were all men who had their skills spread across a wide number of projects at the time of mobilization. The artisans of the tower tried desperately to meet this order by outsourcing to other producers within London, but again, even subcontracting out to artisans in nearby towns, they couldn't reach the numbers required in time. And in fact, all of the wagons that they tried to make had to be sent north via ship, without teams, without leatherwork, and with all their parts numbered for ready assemblage when they got to the northern supply posts. Now, a pattern does emerge when we look across all the wars, which is that almost every wagon that was purchased, as in owned by the state that was fielding, state or force that was fielding the army, went into the artillery train of the army, rather than into other elements of the army's wider baggage train. So didn't go to, the purchased ones didn't usually go to meet officers' needs. They didn't go to meet regimental needs. They didn't go to other experts in the army who needed wagons. They just went to the artillery train, as far as we can tell. And this is probably because the artillery train, despite its name, included all manner of supporting elements essential to a field army on campaign. They were significant in size, and their contribution, their composition contributed to the demand for ever more horses to pull ever more equipment with the army. So an estimate for the necessary vehicles and animals required for a train of artillery in 1639 for the English Royal Army, which they intended to field against Scotland, was that it would need 200 vehicles and over 1,000 horses, with 360 attendant carters or wagoneers. To manage these vast numbers of animals, vehicles, and even the men to work them, the artillery train included such people as wagon masters, conductors, controllers, and commissaries of various kinds. But these weren't the only staffers in an artillery train. The Royalist artillery train in the summer of 1643 included, over and above the officers and artillerymen, surgeons' mates, armourers, gun founders, smiths, farriers, carpenters, wheelwrights, collar makers, coopers, gunsmiths, gunstock makers, turners, ladle makers, a chaplain, and a paymaster. And there were others as well. So it's easy to see why the train was deemed a priority for reliable permanent transport vehicles, because many of the skills of the men working in the artillery train, particularly smiths, farriers, wheelwrights, collar makers, would have been involved in maintaining and repairing the transport vehicles for the whole of the army. But as I said, the demand for vehicles outstripped beyond anything that purchasing or construction could immediately meet. So despite the perceived preference for purchased vehicles, almost every sort of train, artillery train or baggage train of the Civil Wars, was at least partially composed of hired vehicles and teams. When it was clear that purchase alone would not supply the English army forming in the north of England in 1639, again, no one was able to build the 400 wagons in time, the King's Council instead sent out to the Lord Lieutenants of the various shires across England, telling them exactly how many vehicles and teams they needed from each of them to send on to supply the army with its transportation needs. They listed the number of wagons they needed, the number of teams to accompany them, and the carters to operate them. Now, in perhaps a stunning turn of events, which many of the audience might not be surprised, the government in London did not really grasp the situation on the ground within the localities, and there was quite a bit of back and forth between the deputy lieutenants, deputy lord lieutenants of the counties to the government in London, explaining that we don't have any wagons on hand. We can get you carts, but we can't get you wagons. And this was particularly true for counties in the north of England and in the west of England. This all ties in with perhaps why the English armies in both 1639 and 1640 suffered terribly with supply issues. Much is made of the rebellious nature and the revolting of the soldiers on the campaign, but part of that at least was due to the poor supply issue. And the fact that there was so much back and forth about when the wagons would get there, when the carts instead of the wagons would get there, issues around the number of teams. When the government in London said, we need X number of wagons and X number of teams to go with them, that's exactly what the deputy lieutenants provided them with. They provided them with a wagon and team. However, it turns out that the civilian expectation of how many horses are needed to pull a vehicle is rather different to that of the military. Carts could be pulled, dependent on the size of the cart, between 1 and 3 horses, and the military like to use 5. Wagons generally would be 4, sometimes 8 for civilian use, but mostly 4. And the military always liked to use at least 6 horses to pull a wagon. So when the wagons and carts did turn up with the army had to then send to London to say, can you order us more horses? The government duly did, wrote to the Lord Lieutenants, deputy lieutenants then took the orders and collected as many horses as were required from each of their regions and sent them on to the army. No one asked them to include harness. So you've suddenly got this situation where you have a large number of wagons, maybe not all to the type that you want, large number of horses, many of whom don't even have the correct harness needed to connect them to the cart because no one sent them. And there's even surviving documentation of an exchange between the Lieutenant of the Ordnance Office and the Council of War. And the tone of the letter is very much that of a professional military officer trying so hard to remain polite when explaining the realities of harnesses and supply issues to his largely oblivious political superior. So this requisition that the government used at the localities to secure their desired number of teams and vehicles. Requisition would be the term I would use, but it encompasses both hiring and impressment of civilian vehicles. The term hiring suggests a more transactional or collaborative relationship between the carters or the wagon owners and the army, whereas impressment suggests the opposite. But it's not that clear because impressment was a contested term even in this period, and this complicates matters when the sources use that term. It's often a general term, not just for enforced military conscription, like you have to do this, but it's also a term for imposed hiring. So you still enforce people to do what you want, to carry what you want, but you pay them a set fee and it's for a limited period. It's normally like a payment per day or payment per mile in the 17th century. This was nothing new in government service. In fact, temporary impressment of conveyances for official purposes, such as transporting the king's timber, was common enough in peacetime that it was not popular and many people complained about it, not least because Charles's government had a tendency to push the costs of it onto local government rather than divvy up for himself. So an awful lot of the local government representatives, the Lord Lieutenant, and more clearly their deputies, the Deputy Lord Lieutenant, constantly writing to London saying, can you not ask us to do this? We're constantly having to pay the carriers for their burdens. Even if they were hired, any form of impressment was an imposition on the owners and the operators of the vehicles. They'd be taken from other work, which almost certainly paid better if they were carriers, and it certainly paid better than the government rate overall. But if they were not carriers, if they were, say, a farmer, then the vehicle and the team might even be necessary for the owner's livelihood. There is a sense amongst the sources that almost every civilian wagoner, carter, owners of the transportation that's been taken up by the armies is often there under duress. And as the wars got on and the situation for more and more wagons and horses became ever more desperate, much more stringent laws and demands were passed by the military authorities. So, for example, on the 13th of October 1642, as the royalists were trying to build out their baggage and supply and artillery trains, the king had to issue an order that anyone who shall receive warrants for the bringing or signing in of any carts or horses for the use of our train of artillery, that they and every one of them will continue until we release them, and under our express pleasure, otherwise we shall declare them under pain of death. So if you've been hired, or if you've been impressed, or if you've been recruited into the army to serve in the supply train, if you try to leave without our express permission, pain of death. And that is part of the problem in trying to determine if someone was hired or was they impressed, because how they got to the army, when they were in the army, it's how they were released or not released is the main issue, if that makes sense. So there was no way of knowing if the vehicle that was refused permission to leave the army had been brought in by being hired or being simply impressed. The surviving documentation just isn't there. We do know in some cases that Parliament hired carriers to work in the Earl of Essex's artillery train, at least at the start and into the mid-war, simply because parliamentarian sources survive. Even though they were hired, these men still stipulated that they were impressed into service. Again, it muddies the terms a little bit. So, for instance, Robert Bennett was carrying Devonshire cloth from Exeter to London in September 1642, and he was pressed to go into Parliament service in the train of artillery. And while in this role, serving in the train of artillery, Bennett lost his wagon and his horses, being his whole livelihood, at the Battle of Edgehill when the Royalists overran the parliamentarian baggage train. Several carriers were slightly luckier, at least in the short term, than Bennett. They stayed in Parliament service for years. So Isaac Peer, who with his wagon and team served in the Earl of Essex's artillery train from November 1642 until September 1644. However, he also lost his team and wagon when the artillery train was captured by the Royalists after the Battle of Lostwithiel. Even taking into account the bad luck of the enemy overrunning and capturing the vehicle or pack horses that were being used, the militaries were notoriously bad at returning vehicles and teams to their owners. In September 1641, so a year and a half after they'd sent them north, various English counties, including Lincolnshire and Huntingdonshire, were still trying to get their horses and horses and carts back from the government where they'd sent them of spring the previous year. And again, the only surviving source we have of final repayment for service comes from Parliament. There's no surviving evidence I've found of repayment to those who served in the trains of the defeated forces at war's end. But even so, wagoneers working for Parliament had to wait years for repayment, with money not forthcoming until at least 1647, when an ordinance was passed that all such wagoneers that have arrears owing to them for service done with their wagons for the Commonwealth, and what appeared to them to be justly owing to them, will be given payment out of the treasures for maimed soldiers until their debts be cleared. This is not to say that requisition by the armies was wholly negative. From the military perspective, it could be quite an easy and quick way of securing either permanent or short-term transportation, at least in the locality. The decentralized nature of military authority as the wars went on and commanders were further and farther away from the high command or whichever government was giving them orders, the distances between them and their authorities meant that it simply wasn't viable for them to send letters back to, if they were parliamentarians, back to London, or if you were royalists, back to Oxford, to ask for permission to hire or impress carts. You just did it as you needed on site. But again, this still strengthens the fact that commanders and their armies, their supply trains, their vehicles that they used would take on the aspect of what the civilians in the local areas were reliant on. Partially to try and combat this never quite fulfilled demand for enough vehicles and horses for regimental needs and artillery train needs, there were attempts by all the armies to try and draw down on the number of what they saw as useless or excess transportation, and that was mostly in the vein of officers' baggage. When the war started out, officers were often allowed to buy or provide carts or wagons for their own personal baggage, and that was particularly bad in the case of the English army for the Bishop's Wars, where not only in part of regimental demands where each company required a wagon, but almost every officer above a certain grade would have a varying amount of their own personal transport baggage, which would all add to the numbers of horses, the number of wagons. That would slow the army down and require feeding, require more forage, and would just make the whole system that much more bloated. The uh, the allotment for a regiment also saw some damage over, or reduction over the wars. At the start of the wars, in the Bishops' Wars, the English expectation was that one company per regiment, each company per regiment had its own vehicle, and by the end of the wars, that had been reduced to about 2 per regiment. But the First English Civil War does serve as a strong example for the regional variation in civilian vehicles and how this affected the makeup of the supply trains for the armies. So, leaving aside contested areas, the geographical divide between the varying upland and lowland usage of civilian vehicles is interestingly roughly similar to the general pattern of royalist and parliamentarian controlled areas. So, even in the early and into the mid part of the English Civil Wars, the Royalists roughly held in the west, the southwest, and the north, and the parliamentarians, again loosely, drew most of their supply systems from the east and the southeast. So in late 1642, the outbreak of armed conflict in England, this disrupted large parts of the peacetime carrier network, as field officers appear to have secured whatever transport was available. But because the carrier networks quite quickly ceased to operate, as we'll see later, it meant that most of your seized or hired or impressed or even purchased wagons were dependent on where you had areas of control at the time. So if we move on to the next slide, that might be slightly clearer. As you can see, again, compared to the topographical map and to the areas of control, the parliamentarians benefited from their areas of control being areas where the wagon was a very common, very predominant vehicle, whereas the royalists held control in areas where the pack horse would have been the main carrier use, but for a vehicle, for military purposes, it was the cart, the less efficient cart. This is borne out by the sources. So the surviving accounts of the Royalist Ordnance Office very rarely make mention of wagons. It's almost predominantly carts. Even when they're talking about moving artillery pieces with all their equipment, it might be one wagon and 5 or 6 carts in the train to move even 1 or 2 small cannon. In contrast to the English experience, and we're hopping back again to the Bishops' Wars for now, the armies raised in Scotland appear to have relied almost entirely on pack horses as their preeminent form of transportation. There are records of how the Scottish Covenanting Army struggled to find sufficient powerful draft horses to even pull their artillery, let alone any carts that they had. And in 1639, it was made clear that their strategic mobility was heavily limited by their lack of large, powerful horses to pull any artillery they wanted to take with the army, as they had neither carriage horse nor enough convoys to move any supplies for the army. This needs re-emphasizing because the situation the next year was substantially different. Because of their experiences in 1639, in 1640, the Covenanters seem to have done a completely different tack and instead have gathered up to 3,000 pack horses in order to convey its baggage. They still had limited numbers of draft animals. They had tried to buy them before the wars, and funnily enough, the English government in London had stopped the sale of military-grade draft animals to Scotland when they thought there was going to be a conflict. But instead, they focused in 1640 on the pack horses and on very light leather guns that could be stripped down and carried on the back of a pack horse to give them some sense of firepower. These artillery pieces, these very light leather guns as they were able to be carried by horseback, providing the Covenanting Scots with a mobile artillery train that they could actually move with this year, rather than in last year where they were the previous year when they were hampered by it. After they occupied Newcastle upon Tyne, they made use of captured English artillery and captured English draft animals to then rebuild a much more substantial artillery train. But it's interesting that the 1640 often lightning campaign of the Covenanting Scots, which caught a lot of the English army by surprise and was commented by contemporaries that moving so fast that their pack train was the predominant method of them moving their supplies. It wasn't relying on wagons and large teams of horses. It was pack trains of pack horses and pack ponies that were pulling an awful lot of their equipment. This is supported by the fact that as the wars continued, Scottish armies still suffered from a lack of draft animals. So even years later, when the Scottish army was allied with Parliament and was operating into the north of England, the commanding general was complaining that they were suffering great impediment to march south because of our want for draft animals. And another 6 years after that, they were still reliant on pack horses to supply their regimental needs rather than the carts or the wagons that English armies were using. And they stipulated that each company for each of their infantry regiments needed 3 pack horses to carry the ammunition and supplies and food for each of the infantry companies. So this has all been about what the armies included in their supply train when they were operating within either England or Scotland. The situation to supply forces in Ireland from England at the outbreak of the Irish Rebellion in 1641 stands as a sharp contrast. Instead of recruiting or impressing or purchasing civilian wagons and teams into a supply train for an army, that's not what the government in London did. For the English regiments dispatched to Ireland, there was simply no need to create such a supply train. The regiments were mustered near to the ports, usually western ports of Chester and Bristol, and they were shipped over to Ireland as they became ready. And likewise, supplies were sent from London across the carrier network, making use of the civilian carriers across England to the same ports to transport supplies and equipment from, first of all, from London Ordnance Office stores, and then later from as suppliers and purchases and imports became available in London, they would then hire civilian carriers to transport them across England to support Ireland. This broke down after about a year. They started shipping equipment across on the civilian transport network in late 1641, but by late 1642, even the late summer of 1642, tension was growing between the nascent, what would be the Royalist faction, and the parliamentarians, and forces of Royalist cavalry started to intercept these civilian carriers that were transporting military goods from London across to Chester and Bristol. And there is reports of carriers actually being relieved of their goods. So in August 1643, William Whitaker, who had been hired to carry uniforms destined for Ireland, encountered Royalist cavalry under the Earl of Northampton. And they seized his wagon, his 8 horses, and all of the uniforms, and said they should do better to serve the king's soldiers. Several wagons were also seized by the Royalists at the port of Chester, It's unclear whether these were carriers carrying stuff from London to Chester, or whether these were part of that transference of draft animals and vehicles to supply the forces in Ireland to be transported over by ship to support the Protestants there. Either way, the Royalists picked them up and folded them into their growing artillery train. So, as I'm coming to the end now, I'll just emphasize that while I've used transport to highlight the dependency that the armies had on civilians for their supply needs, and it was a dependence, they used civilian vehicles, either made by civilians, owned by civilians, operated by civilians. The nature of what civilians had available impacted what the armies had to use in their supply trains. But this is not only limited to land transportation. Any army on campaign drew heavily on local civilians for everything from transport, whether land, sea, or riverine, but also to shelter, food, clothing, drink. All were drawn from the civilians to supply military needs. The key constant was that the military relied on the civilians having what the army required in order to fulfill their logistical supply needs. So yes, thank you. Any questions?
Glenn, thank you so much. That was brilliant. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, that was really very good. And there are a number of questions that have come into the room, which I'll put to you in a second. You've already answered one of the questions I was going to put to you about how secure were these lines of communication. But I will pass over that and ask the question from Rohan. And Rohan's asked, mules appear to have been more popular in later periods. Why was that not the case in this period?
Now, that is interesting. Mules were very popular in the European experience contemporary to the British Civil Wars, but there's almost next to no mention of them in the sources and records of the period within the conflicts in the British Isles. I can only surmise that the mule is for anyone who don't know, the mule is the like the barren offspring between a donkey and a horse, and it's exceptionally good at carrying loads on its back. It's very hardy. It's great at, much better than a horse at surviving in hot climates and in very poor terrain. But as there's next to no mention of them that I can never find in the British Civil Wars, I can only surmise that because of the laws for breeding from the previous century, passed down from the Tudor period, the private ownership preference for fertile breeding stock, that mules just were not a major part of the equine, I suppose, makeup of Britain in this time. Also, the benefits of the mule for very dry, dusty, mountainous terrain, not very impactful in Britain in this period, as it was, pretty wet, pretty cold. So ponies and horses were probably the preferential choice.
Thank you. Perhaps that might tie into Magnus's question, which is, how did this compare with the armies on the continent in the 30 Years' War?
So it depends on the type of army. It depends on the armies you're talking about. They did certainly make use of mules on the period. On the continent, and this ties in to one of the chapters in the book that I wrote. If we take Gustav Adolphus's campaigns, for instance, in the 30 Years' War, if you look at a map of almost all of his campaigns, they're almost all following the major rivers in Germany. And in the 30 Years' War, many of the supply requirements were based on river transportation as the main contributor to bulk transport. and certainly for artillery pieces, and land transport was sort of a secondary element. I would also suggest that, and this is probably borne out by the horrific experience in the 30 Years' War compared to the British example, foraging and gathering of supplies amongst the civilian populace was far more brutal in the European context and experience than it was in the British Civil Wars, to an extent where it's almost still in the national memory of how brutal civilians suffered at the hand of soldiers desperate to gather what supplies they could. They would certainly have used wagons and carts of varying makes and means, but I also think that the different government structures and the different factions, many of them were private contractor armies in the 30 Years' War, would have had a different mode of either recruitment or hiring of transport. I do know that the Spanish Army of Flanders based most of their supply lines on private contractors. Usually, I think it was Savoyan carters and wagoners.
Thank you. For those who are not in England at the moment, we're still embroidered in our COVID inquiry, and the latest revelations, surprise, surprise, that politicians and scientists spoke different languages. And this goes to Stuart's question, which is, do we also know which commanders grasped most the significance of logistics? His impression is that part of Cromwell's success was his realization early on of the importance of the sinews of war.
So almost all officers at almost every level, even down to company grade officers, were involved in logistics to one degree or another. There was no separate logistical corps, as we might imagine from later periods or later armies. It was part of the responsibility of every officer to help keep his troops in supply. I don't think it's so much the grasp, it's not so much the will, it's the capability of performing logistics. So if we take the perhaps Cromwell's experience in Ireland, from my reading on the situation, one of the reasons Cromwell was so phenomenally successful in Ireland was that he came to Ireland with a tremendous amount of financial backing and fully prepared for what he would find there. The years of warfare in Ireland, and many of it fought in a sort of almost like area denial, burning fields and crops to deny the ability for the armies to supply themselves, happened between both sides. But it did mean that armies were quite static, particularly because they were also equipped with oxen-drawn horses, oxen-drawn vehicles and trains. When Cromwell landed, if you just imagine a picture of the map of his operations, he's operating along the coast. He's taking off an awful lot of either fortified towns or fortresses that are either on the coast or upriver. So he's able to use a completely different type of transportation method to move quicker and easier in and around Ireland. And he just caught the Royalist and Confederate forces were never able to match his speed. And so it's not so much a grasping of the significance of it. He had the financial backing of Parliament. He had all of the superior eastern coastal transportation vehicles from the east of England that he used to transport it. It was a means rather than a grasp.
Thanks. Stuart's asked, do we know what proportion of a baggage train was set aside for transporting what? So how many wagons for food as opposed to powder and shot, for example, and what would be prioritized?
Before canning and refrigeration, transport of food was particularly difficult. It generally took the form of food that could keep. So it would be well-baked bread or biscuit, and it would be salted, barreled pork or beef. In fact, for the protein element of it, many armies preferred cheese rather than meat. But it would all be stuff that could be carried easily and could be transported easily. Unfortunately, it was also very heavy and it was very bulky. So trying to carry all the food you needed in your baggage train was often never achieved. You might give your soldiers enough to march with, but an awful lot of your food and drink would come from foraging. It would come from, while the column was the main column was marching, units of dragoons and cavalry would move out from the line of march, often for several days' distance, knowing where the army would be. And then they would gather up local supplies, often local transportation from local villages, fill it up with everything that they could gather, and then escort it back to the column to then be supplying the troops. So for a marching army marching out of quarters to go and campaign, any food they took with them wouldn't last very long. The priority would be to powder, shot, stuff that they couldn't resupply with any expectation en route.
I think that ties in neatly with Mark's question, which was, what can you say about the impact of transportation difficulties on strategic planning? Were most campaign seasons of indeterminate length due to delays in supply?
I'm going to do that very annoying thing and says it depends on the situation. Yes, if your supply was not guaranteed, you might have to end a campaign early if you couldn't get the basics of necessities to feed your men or even your horses. Remember, even though your horses have more of a flexible diet, as understood by contemporaries, than oxen, they still needed oats, fresh grass, cereal crops. And apart from the grass, most of those could also be eaten by men as well. So even a small army in a very small area would draw down on supplies very quickly. The civilians didn't actually keep much fresh produce on hand. They themselves had to store it. So an army had to almost be constantly moving to constantly find fresh sources of food and supply. Transportation difficulties did have an impact on broader strategic planning. I argue that, for instance, the Royalist assault on the town of Gloucester, which is often portrayed as a disaster, and why did the Royalists do that? If you look at the strategic picture at the time, Gloucester was the only parliamentarian-controlled town on the River Severn. It sat like a blocker on what would have been one of the major supply arteries from the Royalist hinterland right through to its major coastal port. If you removed Gloucester, you effectively turned the River Severn into a phenomenal, uncontested super highway of transportation for men, goods going down one way, imports coming into Bristol from the other. So it definitely had an impact on strategic planning. For strategic operations, you were dependent quite often on what was available in the area, and if your estimate was wrong, then it terminated your campaign.
I can see the parallels with my own hometown of Newark-on-Trent, which was held for the Royalists and was a block on the River Trent. Andrew asks, and it builds on the last two questions really, did armies tend to have a supply chain running back to a base, or did they try to carry key supplies with them and forage for the rest?
There would be a link in the supplies back to base that they wouldn't want to lose, mostly because they wouldn't want to be cut off. But it was predominantly what they carried with them. Think of them as a mobile force. One of the reasons why cavalry and dragoons were so very important in this period was because not only are you trying to secure whatever forage you can along your line of march, you're also trying to stop the other guys from gathering that forage as well. And there are accounts of forages being surprised by those of the other army, driven off, and the supplies they spent all that time gathered into being brought back for the use of the other army. In fact, I think the Battle of Edge Hill serves as a good example. It's not necessarily forage, but part of the element of it is putting your army into temporary quarters. So at the end of the day, you're trying to disperse your army amongst as many civilian communities as possible, so they can effectively be fed by the civilians. And the quartermasters of the army go around and identify, right, this can hold 10 men, this can hold 20, we'll move this company in here. And the parliamentarian and royalist armies just before Edge Hill had no idea where the other one was until two opposing quartermaster parties ran into each other, and then the jig was up and the armies started to concentrate again. And the Earl of Clarendon, in his history of the Civil Wars, makes comment that many of the royalist army hadn't eaten for 2 days before that point. And that was probably a reflection of the fact that they just got to their quarters when they were suddenly summoned back to the regiment and to the rendezvous, and they hadn't had time to eat at the end of what would have been that day's march.
I think, Stuart, that answers your question, which was how much was supply affected by billeting, which civilians seem to have complained about regularly. Do you think that your previous answer answers that question?
I can go into a bit more detail with that, which is that it was heavily affected by billeting, particularly short-term billeting. If it was an army that was going into, say, winter quarters, then the civilians could rapidly adapt to meet the needs of the soldiers that they were quartered with. But if we remember the food of the period, again, it's not refrigeration, it's not tinned. Civilians only keep fresh on hand what they expect to eat in the next couple of days, so it doesn't go stale or the animals don't get to it. But of course, for a household of a half a dozen people, suddenly 10 hungry soldiers get quartered with them, and that supply gets rapidly drawn down very quickly. It seems that as a result, soldiers got into the habit, perhaps not unreasonably, given the fluctuating nature of what food they might expect, of when they set off for march the next day, of taking the food that was most mobile with them. So an awful lot of complaints we have from billeting is soldiers making off with milk cows and pregnant ewes and the family pig, because the soldiers are just trying to make sure they don't starve that day. There is a historical story of predatory soldiers against vulnerable civilians, but I would also add that the soldiers themselves were victims of the vulnerability of their supply lines, and so much of their behaviour can be explained by their need and desire to remain fed.
Thank you. Well, we've got two more questions, and I think I'll probably call that a day then. Rob's asked this question. Do we know to what extent army supply capacity was taken up with dry fodder? How would armies deal with the perpetual consumption curve, draft animals needing to eat a percentage of the supply they were transporting?
We don't have any hard numbers on that. And part of that problem is because many of the records that account for what foragers have taken to take back to the army include stuff that can be fed to both men and animals. So if someone's taking several sacks of oats from a farm back to the army and they record that to send to the parish constable and that finds its way down to us over the centuries, we just don't know what those oats were intended for. Were they intended to be made into a meal like porridge for soldiers, or to feed the horses? So foraging was very definitely a contribution to the feeding of the animals. They didn't rely solely on dry fodder, but neither could they rely very heavily on fresh fodder either. The honest answer is that I can't give you anything in more detail than that.
That's fine. I think that's perfectly good answer, that, Glenn. The last question, therefore, sits with Neil. The French at this time seems to have been developing the use of forward magazines to at least get their armies up to the enemy territory. Were major magazine locations created in the English Civil War?
Yes and no. Sir Jacob Astley, a consummate professional soldier, was sent north by the Council of War in 1638 to ascertain what needed to be done in preparation for the war, the upcoming war with Scotland. And he extensively planned for supply dumps. He even marked out where they would be on the map upriver from Newcastle upon Tyne. He secured costs at the market, and it seems that his plan was that the supplies would be bought at Newcastle, shipped in from London and other places to Newcastle, and then barges would ship them up to various supply dumps that he'd marked along the River Tyne, ready to help support the army. This was never done. One thing about Charles I's wars are always marked with never having enough money to do the things that you want to do, and buying supplies in and setting up a supply depot takes an awful lot of money. There would be regional magazines, most often where there was a fortification that was held by soldiers that were defending a town. They'd have their own magazines, which, when you initially look at the amount of food that they stored, sounds quite a lot. You know, so many thousands of pounds of dried biscuit, barrels upon barrels of wine and everything. But when you actually do the maths about how many men were in the garrison and how much they could hold, how much they would draw down, even on very short rations, those magazines would be depleted within weeks. So it's clear that many of the even the garrisons relied on the local civilians to supply them with food. The Royalist garrison of Lichfield at one point supplied troops to go with one of the field armies, and the field officer is complaining that these Lichfield men have had it so easy being in garrison in fortification, he can't get them to do any work. They do nothing but complain. So it's how much ready cash and how much credit you could deliver to civilians to get them to produce enough for you to then store it was part of the problem of building a substantial magazine, which in France the problem was solved because it was organized at the state level, which by the time of the English Civil Wars was too diffuse an authority to be able to produce enough cash to produce that.
And thank you so much. I don't sort of rank or judge our contributions to these online talks, but I always judge any presentation by the quality of the Q&A session. Has it generated enough questions for people to show that they've been genuinely enthused by it? And how well does the presenter answer those questions? And I think you've given an exemplary example of how to answer these questions. You said you waffled. You're answering a question. You certainly didn't tonight. You covered it all very, very well indeed. And if you turn the chat box back on, you can see that there's some very appreciative comments in the chat box from the audience who have really enjoyed it. And in fact, the publisher will be pleased to hear that you've probably sold a couple of books on the basis of these talk. And just remember that handout does give you a link to Glenn's book. It only remains to say, to remind you of Rohan's suggestion that those who are not members of the society and who have enjoyed this talk might like to make a small contribution, but it's not mandatory. We are taking a pause now for the month of December. We have a full round of talks for 2024 and we'll go out on the Society's webpage and on its social media for announcements of what's coming up. So it just remains for me, Glenn, once again, just to say thank you very much indeed for a really informative talk this evening. And it's always important to have supply and logistics talked about. It's not just generals moving troops across the ground. So with that, I'm going to say goodnight to everybody and see you next year. Thanks, bye.